So, welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty magazine, and I'm here with the one and only my co host, Alan Reinach, who is president of the Church State Council. And together, we're trying to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. And we have an interesting program today. Alan, you and I have both talked about how in recent weeks, the first few weeks of the new presidential administration, there's been a lot of activity and action about trying to stretch executive authority, trying to stretch the constitutional limits of what a president is entitled to do. Does that cross the line into something that's unconstitutional? What does that potentially mean for civil liberties down the track? Well, I took the opportunity to do an interview for Liberty magazine with David French, who is a well known writer on constitutional issues. He's a columnist with the New York Times. He's a longtime litigator of First Amendment issues, and he's also a co host of a wildly successful legal podcast called Advisory Opinions. My only regret with this interview, Alan, is that you couldn't be part of the conversation.
Well, and I have the same regret. I have enormous respect for David French. Um, you could also say he is a wonderful Christian leader because he is.
Absolutely.
So, Bettina, I'm really looking forward to hearing this interview after you record it because I can't stay and join you for it. I'm so sorry. I'm a huge fan of David French, and I'm so glad that you've arranged for this. So take it away.
I really want to focus right out of the gate on this head spinningly fast assertion of maximalist executive authority that we've seen in the last few weeks. Depending on who you're talking to, it's either it's time to break the glass and press a button, or it's just a realignment. We're bringing the role of the executive back to what the founders really intended, energetic executive. Can you help us?
Yeah. Well, I think what we're watching is an attempted constitutional revolution, is a way to put it, where essentially what's happening is that the executive branch, the Trump administration, is trying to assert more raw authority over the federal government than any president, certainly in the modern era. I'm not going to say it's as much as Lincoln, say, in the Civil War, or maybe FDR at the height of World War II. But if you're going to talk about in a time of peace and prosperity, this is absolutely the biggest presidential attempted power grab that we've seen. And so regardless of whether you think the system might need reform, and you put me in that camp, I think there are a lot of things about the federal government that need reform. We should not be reforming the federal government at the expense of the constitutional order. So the constitutional order, contrary to a lot of sort of things that you might think off the top of your head, is not one that is designed to have, quote, co-equal branches of government. It's actually designed for the legislative branch to be supreme.
Uh-huh.
If you think about it, when you read the Constitution, that gets pretty obvious. They can override vetoes. All spending can only come from from Congress with a bill originating in the House of Representatives. They have the ability to fire the president and Supreme Court justices. So this is supposed to be, it's not uncheckable, but it's supposed to be supreme. And now the presidency is asserting itself as supreme. And that is not the intended constitutional order. And that has lots of negative ramifications, even if you are somebody who thinks there's a need for reform in the federal government.
So, how much of what he's doing is technically constitutional within the realms of what's constitutional, but is actually breaking norms, traditions, doing things that previous presidents have not attempted?
Right. So there's a couple of, we could break things down into several different buckets or categories. So one bucket would be just, is this flat out unconstitutional? So for example, there are multiple courts who've already ruled against his effort to revoke birthright citizenship. So that's something that would be just flat out unconstitutional. Then there's another category that is unlawful, but the president argues actually the laws are unconstitutional, that he should have that power. So for example, The ability to hire and fire federal workers is very constrained by federal law. So Trump can appoint, hire, and fire at will the policymakers, the heads of your cabinet agencies, et cetera. But these millions of civil service workers have protection for their jobs. And so Trump has blown through these protections, which are established by Congress. And he argues that because he's the chief executive, he should be able to. And so this is where you're going to have a court fight between his assertion of executive authority and the workers who claim that these statutory protections are enforceable. And then there's a third category, which is he's just blowing through a norm because that he can go through because he has the power unquestionably. So, for example, directing the U.S. UN delegation to vote with Russia and North Korea against Ukraine, for example, that would be where he is obviously blowing through a norm. We never have sided with Russian aggression before. So he's blowing through a norm, but he can do that. He's the nation's chief diplomat. He can decide American foreign policy, constrained by law, but he has enormous flexibility to decide American foreign policy. So that's how I break it down into those general categories.
Okay, so you mentioned the courts and the role that they're going to have in working through this. Are the courts prepared? How effective a check are they going to be on those first two categories that you mentioned?
That's a great question. I would say they're prepared. I would say that the litigants who are involved in the cases have been preparing for these cases for a long time. So some of these confrontations that are happening in court have been already unfolding and debated about for quite some time before Trump actually became president. And so there's a lot of pre-existing legal work to draw on, court precedents that already exist. So in many ways, I'd say the judicial branch is extremely prepared. Now, the judicial branch does not move all that quickly. And so there are ways in which, you can see these things unfold and people are fired and grants are cut off. And you wonder, why isn't anything happening right now? Well, a lot is happening right now. Lots of court filings are being made, but it takes time to adjudicate these things. And so, we'll know a lot more in 5 months, 6 months. We'll know a lot more. But in the meantime, there's an injunction here, there's an injunction there. It's kind of like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. But the courts are prepared. It's just that they're not the primary. They were never intended to be the primary check on a president. That was Congress. Congress is always intended to be the primary check. It can move more quickly. But as we know, Congress is controlled by Trump's party and is very, very, very subservient to Trump. More subservient to Trump than, say, Republicans in Congress were to George W. Bush when he was president.
So, the founders seem to indicate that or hope that the Congress would be sort of jealous of its own prerogatives and that it would defend those prerogatives. How did we get to this point where Congress is now effectively the weakest branch of government?
It's a long, slow decline followed by a precipitous drop off a cliff. So this is that I'm referring back to, was it Hemingway who says, how does a company go bankrupt? Slowly at first, then suddenly. For a lot of time in the modern era, and when I say the modern era, we'll peg it to post-Watergate. Post-Watergate, you had a sort of a modern high water mark of congressional power. Congress had effectively removed a president already, and by 1974, Congress was passing a ton of good government reforms to prevent the rise of another imperial presidency, a term applied to Richard Nixon. And so Congress was at a modern high water mark. And then over time, as America became more partisan, as Americans became more partisan, more entrenched, the incentives for Congress began to shift so that your loyalty to your partisan imperative began to trump your jealousy for your own power in Congress. And this was, again, as a result of feedback that members of Congress were getting from their own constituents. So what began to happen was a dynamic where partisan polarization really, truly increases to a point where your median Democrat and your median Republican really, really, really dislike each other. And so that means there's not so much incentive for compromise. That means that coming home with a big legislative accomplishment where maybe you got some stuff for your district, but a Democrat got something for his district. Those days of bragging about that were over because the Democrat got something, right? And so the partisan imperative and the partisan animosity just kept escalating. And now it's genuinely the case that Speaker Johnson will risk his career if he asserts his independent authority as Speaker of the House to blunt anything that Donald Trump tries to do. And Madison thought that the idea of my position being neutered so thoroughly would be repugnant to me that I would continue to try to exert the power of my position. I don't think he saw how firmly the partisan imperative would take a hold over American hearts to the point where now the voters would say, well, that's all well and good, Mike Johnson, that you've asserted your power. Now we'll take it away from you.
Right.
And we'll give it to somebody who will do exactly what Donald Trump says. And so there's that same phenomenon exists on the Democratic side, not as extreme because we haven't had the Democrats Joe Biden was not a president the way in the manner of Donald Trump. There was more room for disagreement in the Democratic Party, obviously, because they deposed him in the summer of 2024. So, but that partisan imperative has trumped the sort of ambition inherent in your office. In other words, I want to make my office more powerful can mean that I'm out of office. But if I make my office less powerful and I follow along with the big guy, at least I can stay in office. And that's the calculus that's taking place.
So you are tracing the dysfunction back to we the people.
Yes, 100%. Yes. And, look, I understand the frustration that people have, but let me share you two numbers with you. So number one is 17 million, and the next one is 77 million. Okay. 17 million is the number of Americans who voted for Donald Trump in the primaries.
Yeah.
This was in the Republican primary contest. 77 million-ish is the number of people who voted for Donald Trump in the general election. So you'll note a big difference in those two numbers, right?
Yeah.
So the number, and for the Democrats, the difference was even more dramatic. I think it's about 14 million voted for Joe Biden in the primaries, and then about 75 million voted for Kamala Harris. So those two numbers tell the tale of the tape in American politics. Only a minority of American voters participate in the primary process. They essentially select the candidates for the majority to vote on. Now, then the majority votes and goes to the polls and says the same thing every 4 years. How did we get these people? Why is this our choice, right? But I'll tell you why. Because people voted for them and you chose not to participate in that process, okay? So if you want better choices, start participating in the process earlier.
Yeah.
And don't just delegate and punt to the most activist base of American politics and then lament the choices that they deliver to you. So a lot of this is really, I'm not going to say that that politicians don't bear responsibility for lying, for stoking divisions. Obviously they do, obviously. But it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work if the American people weren't so eager to hear it.
I want to ask about the pseudo-Napoleonic of Trump. This idea that he can do whatever he wants so long as it's in the service of his country. How seriously do we take something like this? And really, as you look at the strength of the American Republic, how robust is it in the face of someone who may be sort of asserting this sort of strongman authoritarianism? We've seen what's happened in Poland, in Hungary, and other
Right.
places. Is this a serious possibility?
Yes, it is. It is a serious possibility. We need to take it seriously.
Okay.
And the reason why is if you go back and you look at sort of Donald Trump's first term, there was this phrase that a journalist named Selena Zito came up with that described the way people approach Trump. She said the media took him literally but not seriously, and his supporters took him seriously but not literally. And so what she meant was the media would hear all of his wild pronouncements, believed that he meant them, but didn't think he could win. Like they didn't think he would become president. So he was sort of an object of fascination more than alarm, right? Now, on the on the side of Republican voters, her assertion was that they heard these wild things and knew he was kind of blowing smoke, but directionally they were with him that we do need to crack down on the border. We do, that there are some basic reforms. Well, what we learned in the first term is that he wanted to be taken literally and seriously. And so what you saw was this push and shove throughout his entire first term, where his original team is saying, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. That's too much. That's too far. And that meant, objecting to things like shooting protesters, shooting migrants as they crossed the border, sudden and dramatic withdrawals of troops from Africa, Afghanistan, even potentially Germany. Like all of these things, he had members of his own administration kind of throwing their bodies in front of him. Don't, sir, you can't do this. And then over time, he got rid of those people so that by 2020, and especially the election contest after 2020, he is surrounded primarily by yes men and sycophants. And you saw how far he would be willing to go when he got surrounded by, yes men and sycophants. And so he's picking up where he left off. Nothing about this should surprise anybody. He's picking up where he left off. He's surrounded by people. Instead of General Mattis, he's got Pete Hegseth as a Secretary of Defense. Instead of Jeff Sessions, a very respected senator, he's got Pam Bondi, who was a MAGA Attorney General from Florida. He's got Akash Patel and Dan Bongino at FBI. I mean, these are not people who are going to say no to him on anything. And so what that means is we are now learning how vulnerable the American system is to a person who wants to be a strongman. And this is actually was warned. We were warned about this. The Anti-Federalists looked at the 1787 Constitution and said, this gives too much power to the president. And one thing they really put their finger on was the pardon power. This gives too much power to the president. And for a long time, we don't realize how much the example of George Washington really was a firewall, because he was the first president. He set the model. Yeah. And his model was one of dignity and restraint and honor. And I'm not going to say that everyone who's occupied the office has had those characteristics and qualities, but it is true that presidents have not tended to try to maximize all of the power and authority that they believe they could conceivably get under the Constitution. And so we didn't really realize how much our Constitution depended on an honor system. And now we're learning, and we're learning that when the honor system doesn't hold, the Constitution the constitutional order struggles.
Can you draw some lines between what is happening and protection of our civil liberties and potential red flags or dangers down the track?
Right. Well, the case involving the Associated Press is very interesting because, as a general matter, if there's limited office space, for example, or limited space for media, you do have to make choices as to who gets the space that's available. If you can't give it to everybody, there has to be some system for making available the space. But under our constitutional structure, as a general rule, you can't pick and choose based on preferred viewpoint. In other words, you can't say, well, you're a friendly news outlet, so you get 100% access. You're an unfriendly news outlet, so you're out of the building. That kind of viewpoint discrimination violates the First Amendment. And so I would say that the Associated Press has a pretty good chance in its lawsuit. Now, I mean, of course, there's going to be some deference given to the executive to determine how to allocate limited spaces. But they've been so upfront that they did this on the basis of the AP not wanting to use the phrase Gulf of America, that the approved language, I guess that's what right-wing woke looks like. You have to say this language. And so that gives them a much better shot at winning this case, because the administration has been so openly saying that they're taking this action to punish AP for how it speaks. And so I think that this is a canary in the coal mine moment, because one thing that we are seeing is that if you are allied with Trump, the rule of law may not apply to you anymore. I mean, the January 6th protesters and rioters pardoned, granted clemency. Rod Blagojevich, the disgraced former governor of Illinois, granted a pardon for Why? I mean, he's bragged that he's a Trumpocrat. I mean, I guess that's the reason. We just saw Eric Adams corruption charges dismissed against Eric Adams without prejudice on the apparently so that he would cooperate with the Trump administration's immigration agenda, a quid pro quo that led to a bunch of DOJ attorneys resigning. And then at the same time, so those are all his friends who's given benefits to. At the same time, he's fired the people who worked on Jack Smith's investigation. He has lifted the security details from Fauci, from John Bolton, from Mike Pompeo, and even worse, announced it to the world, their vulnerability. And so what you're beginning to see is a kind of a two-tiered system. If you're a friend of Trump, criminal law may not even apply to you. If you're perceived as an enemy of Trump, he's, for some people, he's taken steps that have put their lives in danger. So if you focus and you defend civil liberties, focus on civil liberties and defend civil liberties, these are dangerous times. And what makes it even a little bit more dangerous is this is happening at the same time that he's sort of bragging about doing the opposite. They talk about restoring, not that they're not going to weaponize the Justice Department, that they've just weaponized. They talk about that they're incredibly transparent when they're actually lying. They're talking about they're for free speech while they're cutting out media they don't like. So a lot of their constituents don't even realize what's happening here. They think they're voting for, say, free speech, but what they're getting is just a different form of censorship.
I don't know if you saw the speeches that the president gave at the 2 national prayer breakfast events, but there was a lot of rhetoric in there as, we're going to make the country more prosperous, more faithful to our God than ever before, and this sort of very Christian nationalist type of rhetoric. What do you see as the Christian? I mean, the Christians pushed Trump over the line last year. So what have they gained? Have they got the champion they think they have?
Well, this is a very interesting thing, Bettina, because there is one cohort of Christians who pushed Trump over the line, and that's white evangelicals.
Okay.
There are other cohorts of Christians who voted against Trump. So Black Protestants, for example, who have a very similar high view of Scripture, for example, very similar theologically in a lot of ways to white evangelicals. They voted overwhelmingly against him. Non-white evangelicals were much more evenly split. Catholics, much more evenly split. So, it's very interesting when we break all of this down. I tend to think of it as what does it mean what did Trump's constituency believe that it was getting from him, this white evangelical constituency?
Okay.
And I think what they thought they were getting from him was a fighter. And, this goes back to something that I think is very deeply ingrained in a lot of evangelical culture. And here's how I've put it. I would say that an enormous number of evangelicals grew up with a fight the world view of Christianity as opposed to a love your neighbor view of Christianity. And now I know that there are those two concepts don't necessarily conflict in all ways, but when I'm talking about directionally, were you sort of raised to think persecution is coming? We're an embattled minority. We're one generation away from churches closing. We're looking for signs of the end times. And so all of this is sort of like a fight, what you might call fight or flight Christianity. Yeah. That is, we have to, protect ourselves. We have to be ready. And I remember being raised like that in youth group, and you're going to be persecuted. And I was so alert for persecution. And if I was out and somebody offered me a beer and I said no, and they're like, oh, come on, man. I was like, there it is. There's the persecution. But no, we became alert and aware of anything that appeared to be like an encroachment on our rights, on our authority. And that's the atmosphere that not in my home, but sort of in my denomination. That's how I grew up. In my home, I grew up as a love your neighbor Christian. Yeah. That you did not look at the people outside the church as a threat. You looked at them as, fellow human beings created in the image of God to be loved. And so that alters your approach to the world. And what I believe is that an enormous segment of the white evangelical church has been caught up in that fight or flight Christianity to such an extent that even though Trump isn't a Christian, the fact that he's a fighter has connected with them at a heart level. It's like calling out to like, that inclination towards political combat.
So the president's announcement of this anti-bias, Christian bias task force, that's just bolstering that same narrative, right?
Absolutely bolstering this narrative that he's their bulwark against destruction. Now, the irony here, Bettina, is that this same guy who went to the prayer breakfast and said all of this stuff is now defunding Christian organizations at a level that we have not seen in a generation. So he is yanking from Christian organizations all around the world, around the country, funding that really has been a key part of their ministry service for years. You know, you go back to Bill Clinton and Charitable Choice, you go back to George W. Bush. His very first executive order was to incentivize faith-based initiatives, because both the Clinton and Bush administrations saw that religious nonprofits were better at delivering services often than the government or secular nonprofits. And so legally, for example, in my legal career, we fought for equal access to funding to serve the poorest and most marginalized people in the world. And so we won that fight. And actually, it's one of the really genuinely good things that our government has done is opened up grant making to all nonprofits and NGOs, regardless of their religious point of view. So if you can serve the poor effectively, whether you're secular or Christian, you can be funded. And now he's yanking all of that. It's gone to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And so at the same time, he's going to the National Prayer Breakfast and declaring that he's going to defend Christianity. Right. His administration is engaging in the largest scale defunding of Christian ministries that I've seen in my life.
And at the same time, there are Christian organizations filing suits saying that their expressive association rights and First Amendment are being infringed. And, you know, I'm with the Adventist Church, we are seeing a significant decline in attendance in certain events in certain places in the country. So it seems like that is an actual thing, right?
It is absolutely. So what we've seen are traditionally immigration enforcement was not, people could go to church and not feel like that they were going to be deported going to church. Their kids could go to school without alarms or concerns that they might be grabbed out of school, that there were certain places and locations that they're not, you know, you don't want to use the term sanctuary, but this is not where the emphasis of law enforcement was on immigration enforcement. And some of that is changing now to the point where religious organizations who serve migrants, and I'm not talking about hide migrants. They don't hide them away. I'm talking about just give them food and clothing and shelter, are now facing punitive government action. And this is happening in Texas at the hand of Texas state authorities. There was just a court decision handed down this week in Maryland, actually drafted by a good friend of mine, a federal judge who's a good friend of mine from law school, that was blocking, and he blocked some of the immigration enforcement actions that were taking place around churches, and a number of Quaker organizations had brought suit. And so there is a very real threat to religious liberty coming out of the mass deportation mindset, because many Christian ministries, they serve the poor and marginalized without regard to, are you here legally or not legally? I mean, look, you know, Scripture tells us to serve prisoners, right? Prisoners, people have been convicted of crimes. We're to look out for them and to care for them. So if we're supposed to care for prisoners, you know, caring for the basic needs of migrants is it's a scriptural imperative. And for the government to come in and begin to take punitive action is a grave violation of the First Amendment and religious free exercise.
You've been so generous with your time. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
You're very welcome. The time flew by. Thank you so much.
It sure did. Thank you.
Well, Bettina, this is certainly a topic we're going to want and need to come back to. Because while it may not be directly a religious liberty issue at all times and goes far beyond that, it's essential to how our government functions and whether it functions according to the way that our founding fathers bequeathed us a balance of power, a separation of powers, a democracy, a government, as Abraham Lincoln had said so beautifully, of, by, and for the people. Thanks for joining us once again on Just Liberty. Until next week, I'm Alan Reinach with my co-host, Bettina Krause. And please do remember that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So don't tune out.